Hello, I'm Josh Grew, a researcher at the think tank Living and Dying Well, which provides research and analysis surrounding the end of life debate. And this is the third of a series of short interviews on the topic of assisted dying. It's great to be joined by Rees Johnson, a lecturer at Essex Law School. He's also undertaking a PhD at the University of Manchester. His research focuses on matters pertaining to the end of life, biolaw and biopolitics, and critical perspectives in medical law. Thanks so much for your time, Rees.
Thank you very much, Josh, and thanks for that great introduction.
So, first of all, what impact do you see assisted dying having on ethnic minorities?
Okay, this is a really interesting and important question, and sort of points to certain aspects of the debate that aren't often acknowledged. I think for me, the biggest impact as a person of color is the consequence of introducing a new culture of death within the hospital wing and the impact that this might have on the delivery of care in an ethnic minority context. Now, currently, ethnic minorities in this country already have a delivery of care that is compounded by racial inequalities, leading to harmful outcomes. Ethnic minority women are three to four times more likely to die during childbirth. They were 2 to 3 times more likely to die from COVID. And we know that the cause of that was not solely driven by health issues alone. People from ethnic minorities have a much lower survival rate with regards to certain types of cancer and often report dissatisfaction with their care compared to white ethnic groups. Now, all of this is taking place presumably where sufficient safeguarding mechanisms are in place in order to protect seeming marginalized communities. Yet ethnic minorities are still dying at a disproportionate rate. So what happens then when the culture of life essentially is replaced by a culture of death brought in through the introduction of assisted death laws? The inequalities that we already see today are happening when death is not supposed to form part of a doctor's repertoire of care. Are we to assume that those provisions and safeguards in other aspects of healthcare are defective? If so, why should the safeguards in the matter of assisted death be any different?
Thank you. And secondly, are there issues particularly pertinent to ethnic minorities that make the notion of assisted dying more or less dangerous?
Yeah, I think obviously there's a major issue regarding safeguarding and whether proposed amendments to the law sufficiently cater for marginalized communities. I recognize that what people have proposed involves the requirement of a form that is signed, free and consenting, with the support of 1 or 2 doctors. My concern is the lead up to the signing of that form with respect to ethnic minorities. This is not to say that ethnic minorities are not capable of exercising their own judgment, but I do question whether these go far enough to protect marginalized communities. I think the main issue ultimately refers to the sort of overuse of the discourse of choice. Typically, assisted dying is framed in the context of choice, that people should have the right to choose, or that we ultimately should give people the choice to choose when and how to die. Now, I understand obviously the logic behind this. It serves an important function in terms of being able to reframe the compulsion to die through a lens of choice, which ultimately grants the feeling of empowerment. But when it comes to ethnic minorities, there's a really important question that needs to be answered with regards to the supposed universality or ahistorical foundations of the discourse of choice. The thing is that choice in a healthcare or clinical setting, rather than being free and reflexive, is informed and constrained by sociocultural and economic structures and other social aspects of daily life, all of which play a big role in people's engagement with healthcare, and which also informs and shapes certain practices and expectations, which ultimately contributes to healthcare outcomes. What a person may be free to choose varies considerably depending on what class or race they belong to. And so it's made significantly worse where ethnic minorities fall within a lower socioeconomic category. Often ethnic minorities are not free to choose, and in some cases are forced to have unnecessary treatment, have other available options withheld, or are sometimes pushed into more risky pathways. So the choice either becomes the choice between one form of extreme care, which is deemed good because it's deemed to be the only option, or no care at all. And the way in which ethnic minorities describe pain or discomfort is often overlooked, despite the fact that it's likely a medical indication. When it's ignored, there's a risk that it will be framed by others, by attending doctors, for example, in prejudicial ways, which ultimately furthers existing stereotypes. So when people from marginalized communities, from ethnic minority communities, find themselves in a clinical setting, they often have to contend with the desire not to reinforce certain negative stereotypes that the doctors in their care might have. Now, why is this significant? Well, because the MO of the pro-assisted lobby is very much about the reduction of pain and suffering. But what happens when historically and structurally your pain and suffering is marginalized or minimized? Would ethnic minorities even find themselves candidates for this new law if no doctor is willing to pay significance to their pain and suffering anyway? And the truth is that in those places where it's legal, ethnic minorities are by and large not choosing this kind of death. In those states in the US where it's legal, white patients make up the majority of cases. In 2021 in Oregon, 95% of recipients of assisted death were white. This has largely been the case since its inception. In California, it was almost 87%, in Washington, 93%, and in New Jersey, 94% of beneficiaries of assisted dying laws were white. Yet in all of these states, ethnic minorities disproportionately make up the number of in-hospital deaths, deaths from cancer, and deaths in maternity. So the implication here is that in America, if you're white, you get to choose to die. And for ethnic minorities, it really is very much the luck of the draw. None of these numbers should be surprising, but ethnic minorities have largely had to contend with a history of exploitation for the purpose of furthering medical innovation, racism in healthcare, and the guiding ethical principles used to determine good medical practice has historically ignored ethnic minorities and generally disregards the social and cultural sources and implications of its own thought. All of these things have resulted in increased levels of distrust amongst ethnic minorities. But I think the expectation of the pro-assisted suicide movement really is that in this context, ethnic minorities are encouraged to suspend their distrust and to forget all of these important contexts. Also, that those who have the privilege, capacity, and reflexivity to choose have the option if and when they so fancy it.
And finally, how do you think could law and infrastructure be strengthened to help those who are suffering at the end of life in a way that takes autonomy into account and the ability to choose, as you say, as well as the need to protect minorities?
But I think ultimately we found ourselves in a situation where individual narratives of suffering are ultimately used and often exploited in order to challenge and subvert established expert medical knowledge, which ultimately obscures a whole tradition and lineage of care and comfort that we've seen since the inception of modern palliative care and the hospice care since roughly the 1950s. I think the way in which law could step in this context ultimately is placing a greater emphasis on palliative and hospice care and ensuring that the right and access to excellent palliative care and hospice care is widely distributed across the whole of the country rather than just pockets, and that the force of law steps in to ensure this right. But if we're to go there with regards to assisted dying, I think ultimately we probably need to dispense with the vision that this should be a matter for doctors in the NHS to reconcile with. I don't think that that assisted death should ultimately feature within the NHS delivery of care, and partly because of where where the health system sits within the state. I think to inculcate death within the repertoire of medical options is ultimately to bring the state to have an essential role in dictating the boundaries of possibility within that. And I find that very concerning.
Thank you so much, Rees, for sharing your perspectives there. Do watch out for the next interview in the series, and in the meantime, head to the Living and Dying Well website at livinganddyingwell.org.uk to find more research and information. And thank you for listening.